The crack of a body hitting rubber matting echoed off cinder block walls, and 50 soldiers went dead silent. Ethan Carter lay flat on his back, staring at fluorescent lights, while Cole Mercer stood over him, grinning, boot planted an inch from his ribs. "You're too weak to wear that uniform." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. A single father, a man who'd read his daughter a bedtime story 8 hours earlier, had just been slammed to the floor in front of an entire company, and not one soldier in that gym said a word to stop it. 3 seconds. That's all it would eventually take for every one of them to regret staying silent. But that moment hadn't come yet. Right now, all they saw was a broken-down logistics clerk getting exactly what they thought he deserved. 2 weeks earlier, nobody could have imagined it would come to this. The alarm went off at 500, same as every morning, and Ethan was already awake before it finished its first cycle. He silenced it with a tap, sat up in the dark, and listened. Down the hall, Lily's door was still closed. Good. She had another hour before she needed to be up for daycare. He moved through the apartment quietly, coffee maker uniform boots, the same routine he'd run 1,000 times since Sarah died. Discipline wasn't something the army taught him. Discipline was what kept him standing upright some mornings. By 05:45, he was at his desk in the supply office, manifest sheets stacked in front of him, checking numbers against inventory. Nobody else wanted to count. It was quiet work. Invisible work. Exactly the kind of work Ethan had chosen on purpose. At 06:30, Corporal Danny Cruz stuck his head through the doorway. "Sergeant Carter, PT formation in 15. I heard the horn, Cruz. You always get here first, you know that." Danny grinned, young enough that the army still felt like an adventure to him instead of a grind. "Nobody beats you in." "Nobody wants my job," Ethan said, not looking up from the clipboard. Danny laughed and disappeared back down the hall. Ethan allowed himself a small smile before it faded, because in 20 minutes he'd be standing in that gym again, and there was only one man on this base who made mornings feel like something to dread. Cole Mercer ran PT, like he was auditioning for a highlight reel. He stood at the front of formation in a skin-tight compression shirt that showed off every muscle he'd built through hours. Nobody else had to spare black belt slung over one shoulder like a trophy. He wanted everyone to notice. "Morning, ladies and gentlemen," his voice boomed across the gym. "Today we're going to talk about standards, because apparently some people in this unit have forgotten what it means to actually earn that uniform." His eyes found Ethan immediately. They always did. "Carter." Cole's grin spread. Front and center. A few recruits exchanged glances. This had become routine enough that some of them almost looked forward to it, the way people rubberneck at a car accident. Ethan set his clipboard down on the bleachers and walked forward. "You know what I did last night, Carter," Cole said, circling him now. "I watched game film of my last tournament. 41 seconds to a submission. 41 seconds, and that guy had 2 inches and 20 pounds on me." He stopped in front of Ethan, close enough to make a point of it. "You know what you did last night?" Ethan didn't answer. "I bet you made mac and cheese," Cole said, and the gym erupted into laughter. "I bet you tucked your kid in and then sat alone in your apartment because that's what guys like you do. You gave up. Somewhere along the way, you just gave up." "Sergeant Mercer." Ethan's voice was flat even. "We have formation in 3 minutes." "We've got formation whenever I say we've got formation." Cole snapped back, and something flickered behind his eyes. Irritation, because Ethan never gave him the reaction he was fishing for. "You know what your problem is, Carter. You think staying quiet makes you look strong. It doesn't. It makes you look like exactly what you are." He turned to the recruits. "A man who used to be a soldier and now he's just furniture." Laughter again, louder this time, feeding off itself. Ethan stood there and absorbed it the way he absorbed everything. Still silent, eyes forward. Inside, something old stirred something with teeth, but he'd buried that thing so deep and for so long that even he sometimes doubted it still existed. He clenched his jaw, once barely visible, and said nothing. "Nothing," Cole pushed. "Not one word. No, Sergeant." Cole shook his head, disgusted, like he'd been cheated out of something. Get back in line. Ethan turned and walked back to his spot in formation, and the whole way there, he could feel every set of eyes on him weighing him, deciding what kind of man he was based on 30 seconds of silence. He'd learned long ago there was no version of this where explaining himself made it better. So he didn't try. By the time PT ended, word of the exchange had already spread through the barracks the way rumors always did. Faster than anything official, twisted a little more with every retelling. By breakfast, some recruits were saying Ethan had frozen up completely. By lunch, someone claimed he'd nearly cried. None of it was true. None of it mattered. The story people wanted to believe about him had already been written long before he arrived on this base, and nothing he did seemed to change the ending. He found Danny Cruz waiting outside the supply office when he came back from chow. "Hey, Sergeant." Danny fell into step beside him. "You good?" "I'm fine, Cruz. Mercer was out of line back there. Everybody thinks so." Everybody was laughing, Ethan said, and it wasn't bitter, just true. Danny didn't have an answer for that. They walked in silence for a moment before he tried again. "My uncle was Army. 2 tours in Iraq. Never talked about it, not once. But there was this thing about him, you just knew not to mess with him. Same energy you've got, honestly." Ethan glanced sideways at him. "Careful, Cruz. Comparing me to a war hero might go to my head." Danny laughed, and for a second the tension in Ethan's shoulders eased. Then Danny's smile faded and he said, quieter now, "Mercer's getting worse, though. Not just with you. He backed me into the loading dock yesterday over paperwork. Had his hand right up by my head. I thought he was going to hit me." Ethan stopped walking. "He put hands on you." "Not exactly, just close. Close enough." Something shifted in Ethan's expression, something small but unmistakable. "If he does that again, you come find me. Understood?" Danny blinked, surprised by the sudden edge in his voice. "Yes, Sergeant." Ethan started walking again, and Danny had to jog a few steps to catch back up, unsure what exactly he'd just witnessed, but certain it was the most alive he'd ever seen Ethan Carter look. That evening, Ethan picked Lily up from the base daycare center at exactly 17:30 the way he did every single day without fail. She came barreling across the room the second she saw him through the glass door backpack, half off one shoulder, a drawing clutched in her fist. "Daddy, look!" She thrust the paper at him before he'd even crouched down. "It's you, in your uniform. I gave you a cape." Ethan took the paper and studied it like it was a classified briefing. A stick figure in green with a red triangle cape, standing next to a much smaller stick figure with pigtails. "Why do I have a cape?" "Because you're a superhero," Lily said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "Miss Rivera said superheroes protect people. You protect people. You protect me." Ethan's throat tightened just slightly. He forced a smile. "I don't know about superhero, baby girl. I just try to be a good dad." "Same thing," Lily said with the absolute confidence only a 6-year-old can carry, and grabbed his hand to pull him toward the door. They walked home the long way past the parade field because Lily liked to count the flags. She talked the whole way about a boy in her class who'd eaten a crayon about a caterpillar she'd found on the playground fence, about whether caterpillars got scared before they turned into butterflies. Ethan listened to every word like it was the only news that mattered that day because to him it was. By the time they reached the apartment, the Jim Cole, the laughter, all of it had faded into something distant and unimportant. This was the part of the day that was real. This was the part he protected. Later, after Lily's bath, after 2 chapters of a book about a dragon who was afraid of flying after the 3rd glass of water she insisted she absolutely needed before bed, Ethan finally sat down alone at the kitchen table. He didn't turn on the TV. He didn't check his phone. He just sat there in the quiet, running his thumb along the edge of a coffee mug he wasn't drinking from, letting the day settle over him. A knock came at the door, 3 quick raps familiar. He didn't need to check the peephole. "It's open, Marcus." Marcus Webb let himself in, same as always, dropping into the chair across from Ethan, like he'd been assigned that exact seat by some standing order. "You look like a man who had a rough one." "I'm fine." "You keep saying that." "Because it keeps being true. Marcus studied him for a long moment, the kind of look only an old friend earns the right to give. Danny Cruz told half the mess hall you nearly took Mercer's head off today. Said you had this look on your face like you were about to do something. I didn't do anything. I know. That's what worries me. Marcus leaned forward, elbows on the table. Ethan, I've known you 2 years. I've watched that man humiliate you in front of God and everybody, and you never so much as raise your voice. But today, Cruz says you looked different, like something almost slipped. Ethan was quiet for a moment, staring at the mug in his hands. He threatened Cruz, backed him into the loading dock, hand up by his head. And that's what got to you. Not what he did to you, what he did to somebody else. It's not the same thing. Why not? Ethan looked up, and for the first time in a long time, Marcus saw something raw behind his eyes. Because when it's just me, I can control it. I can take whatever he throws and walk away because I promised Lily she'd never watch her father become a man who solves problems with his hands. But if he starts putting hands on soldiers under my watch, on kids who trust me to look out for them. He stopped himself, jaw tight. That's a different promise. Marcus sat back slowly. What promise is that? Ethan didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped low, almost like he was talking to himself. The one I made before Lily. The one that got me out of a life most men don't walk away from clean. Marcus had heard pieces of this before. Fragments Ethan let slip on nights when the walls came down half an inch. He knew better than to push. You ever gonna tell me the whole story, or am I gonna keep getting it one word at a time for the next 10 years? A faint, tired smile crossed Ethan's face. Maybe when Lily's old enough to hear it herself. Marcus nodded, letting it go the way he always did. He stood up, clapped a hand on Ethan's shoulder on his way to the door. Just watch yourself, all right, men like Cole. They don't stop because you're patient. They stop because somebody makes them. And I've got a feeling that somebody's gonna end up being you, whether you want it or not. The door clicked shut behind him, and Ethan sat alone in the silence for a long time after staring at nothing, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the faint sound of Lily's box fan through the wall. The next few days followed the same pattern, each one sharpening the one before it. Monday, Cole made Ethan run an extra 2 miles after PT. For showing up with an attitude. Though Ethan hadn't said more than 4 words all morning. He ran it without complaint, lungs burning, sweat soaking through his shirt, while Cole leaned against the fence timing him on his phone just to make a show of it. Tuesday, Cole cornered him in the equipment room. You ever gonna fight back, Carter? Or is that just not in you? I've got nothing to prove to you, Sergeant. Everybody's got something to prove. Cole stepped closer, testing him the way he always tested him. Or maybe you're just scared. Maybe underneath all that quiet, there's nothing there at all. Ethan met his eyes and held them steady, unblinking, long enough that something flickered across Cole's face. Not quite doubt, but close to it. Then Ethan turned and walked out without a word, and Cole was left standing alone in the equipment room, oddly unsettled by a silence he couldn't explain. Wednesday. It got worse. Ethan was walking Lily to daycare when Cole passed them on the sidewalk, jogging with 2 other instructors. He slowed just enough to say loud enough for Lily to hear, "Morning, Carter. Taking your daughter to school before you go hide behind your desk again." Lily looked up at her father, confused. "Why's he being mean to you, Daddy?" Ethan felt something crack, quiet and internal, a hairline fracture in a wall he'd spent years reinforcing. He crouched down to her level, kept his voice gentle. "Some people just aren't very nice, baby girl. That doesn't mean you have to be like them." "But you're the strongest person I know," Lily said with the simple, devastating honesty only a child can offer. Ethan hugged her tighter than usual that morning, and when he stood back up, his eyes had gone somewhere far away, somewhere Cole Mercer, jogging off down the sidewalk without a second thought, would never in his life understand. By Thursday, the base rumor mill had turned the whole situation into a running joke. Soldiers in the mess hall started calling Ethan Sergeant Silent, behind his back, some laughing, a few uncomfortable, but staying quiet because staying quiet was easier than standing out. Danny Cruz overheard 2 privates doing an impression of Ethan freezing up in the gym and nearly got into a shouting match defending him before Ethan intervened and told him to let it go. "Why do you let them talk about you like that?" Danny asked afterward, frustration evident in his voice. "You could shut all of it down in about 10 seconds if you wanted to." "Could I?" "I've seen the way you move, Sergeant. The way you watch a room. That's not nothing. That's not some desk clerk who's never seen combat." Ethan was quiet for a moment, weighing how much to say. "There's a difference, Cruz, between what a man is capable of and what kind of man he chooses to be. I made a choice a long time ago. I'm not interested in unmaking it because a bully wants an audience. Even if the whole base thinks you're weak. Especially then." Danny didn't fully understand it, not yet, but something in the way Ethan said it made him stop pushing. That Thursday night, after Lily was down, Ethan opened the bottom drawer of his dresser, the one he rarely touched, and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside sat a folded photograph, edges soft from handling, and beneath it, tucked flat, a set of orders and commendations he hadn't looked at in years. He didn't unfold the orders. He never did anymore. He just held the photograph. Sarah smiled up at him from the hospital bed, exhausted and radiant. A newborn Lily wrapped in a blue blanket against her chest. He remembered every second of that day with a clarity that still hurt. He remembered the weeks after too, the ones nobody talked about, the slow unraveling, the promise he'd made sitting beside a bed that wasn't a delivery room anymore. "Promise me you'll raise her soft, Ethan. Promise me you won't let what you were become what she has to live with." He'd promised. He'd meant it with everything he had. And every single day since he'd kept that promise, even when it meant standing in a gym and letting a man half as capable as he used to be call him weak in front of 50 witnesses. Even when it meant biting down on something ancient and dangerous inside himself and burying it deeper every time it stirred. He put the photograph back in the box, closed the drawer, and sat in the dark a long while. He didn't know yet that Friday would be different. He didn't know that the promise he'd guarded so carefully for 6 years was about to be tested in front of the entire base in a way that would leave him no room left to walk away. All he knew sitting there in the quiet of his apartment with his daughter asleep down the hall was that something in Cole Mercer's eyes had started changing over the past week, a hunger and impatience, like a man who could sense he was circling something he didn't fully understand and was determined to provoke it out into the open no matter what it cost. He was right to sense it. He just had no idea what he was about to wake up. Monday morning came in gray and cold, the kind of sky that made the whole base feel like it was holding its breath. Ethan was at his desk by 05:45. As always, manifest sheets stacked neat in front of him, but his hands weren't quite steady the way they usually were. Something in him hadn't settled since Thursday night, since he'd sat alone with that photograph in his lap and felt the old promise creak under new weight. He didn't know yet that Cole had spent the weekend building something ugly. At PT formation, Cole didn't call him out right away. That was new. He let the silence stretch, let Ethan stand there in the third row, wondering if maybe, just maybe, the man had finally lost interest. Then halfway through warm-ups, Cole's voice rang out across the gym like a gunshot. "Change of plans today. We're doing something special." He clapped his hands together, grinning at the recruits like he was about to hand them a gift. "Carter's gonna show us what real conditioning looks like." Ethan's stomach dropped, but his face stayed still. "Front and center, Sergeant." He walked forward. 50 faces turned to watch, and this time there was an edge to the room that hadn't been there before, anticipation, the kind that comes right before something people know is going to be ugly. "Here's the deal." Cole paced in front of him, hands clasped behind his back, like a drill instructor from an old war film. "You're gonna do burpees. You're gonna keep doing them until I say stop. And every single time you stop before I say so, we're gonna add 10 more for the whole formation. So really, Carter." He turned to the recruits with a smile that made Ethan's jaw tighten. "His weakness is about to become everybody's problem." A murmur went through the crowd. Somebody groaned. A young private near the front shot Ethan a look that wasn't mockery. It was dread, plain and simple, the look of someone who knew exactly what was about to happen to their morning. "Begin." Ethan dropped and started moving. Down chest to floor, up jump, hands overhead. Down again. The rhythm was familiar, almost meditative, something his body remembered from a different life entirely, a life where physical suffering had been a language he spoke fluently. But he made himself look labored, made himself breathe hard on cue, stumble slightly on the landings. Because if he moved the way his body actually wanted to move, if he let even a fraction of what he used to be slip out in front of 50 witnesses, the questions that would follow would be worse than anything Cole could throw at him. 20 burpees and sweat already soaking through his shirt. Cole crouched down next to him, voice low enough that only Ethan could hear it. "You feel that burn yet, Carter?" That's what happens to men who let themselves go soft. Your body forgets what it used to be capable of. He straightened back up, raised his voice again for the crowd. "Keep going. 40 burpees. 50. Ethan's lungs were actually starting to protest now, the acting and the reality blurring together, sweat stinging his eyes. He caught Danny Cruz's face in the crowd, jaw clenched, hands balled into fists at his sides, looking like he wanted to step in and knowing he couldn't. 60 burpees. Cole clapped slowly, mockingly. "Look at that. Sergeant Carter, ladies and gentlemen. This is what 4 years behind a supply desk gets you. 70. Ethan's arms were shaking now genuinely, and somewhere in the haze of exhaustion, a small, dangerous voice in the back of his mind whispered that he could end this in about 4 seconds if he wanted to, one clean strike to the throat, and Cole Mercer would never open his mouth like this again. He shoved the thought down so hard it felt like swallowing glass. At 80, Cole finally raised a hand. "All right, that's enough. Fall back in line, Carter." Ethan stood, legs trembling for real now, and walked back to his spot without a word. The formation resumed a normal workout around him, and nobody said anything to him for the rest of PT. Though he could feel the eyes on him, curious and pitying in equal measure, the kind of attention that hurt worse than the insults themselves. Later that morning in the equipment room, Danny found him restocking resistance bands. "That wasn't training," Danny said, voice tight with anger he wasn't bothering to hide. "That was him trying to break you in front of everybody." "I know what it was, Cruz." "Then why didn't you say something? Why do you just let him—" "Because the moment I give him a reaction," Ethan said, setting the bands down and finally looking at him directly. "He wins twice over. He gets to humiliate me, and then he gets to say I couldn't handle it. I'm not giving him both." Danny shook his head, frustrated, not fully buying it, but not knowing how to argue with a man who clearly had more experience carrying weight than he did. "It's not right, Sergeant." "No," Ethan agreed quietly. "It's not." By Wednesday, Cole had found a new phrase, and it spread through the base faster than anything before it. He said it first at lunch loud enough for 3 tables to hear while Ethan sat alone by the window, the way he always did. "You know what the recruits are calling him now?" Cole said to a group of instructors gathered near the drink station, tilting his head toward Ethan without lowering his voice at all. "The weakest dad in the Army." He laughed, delighted with himself. "I mean, come on, look at him. Man can't even hold his own in a gym, and he's supposed to be raising a kid on his own. God help that little girl." The mention of Lily hit Ethan like a physical blow, sharper than anything that had come before it. His fork stopped halfway to his mouth. He set it down slowly, deliberately, and did not turn around. By the time he stood to leave, the phrase had already made its rounds weakest. "Dad in the Army," repeated with laughter at 2 more tables before he even made it to the door. He heard it again that afternoon from 2 privates he passed in the hallway, not realizing he was close enough to catch it. He heard it a 3rd time from someone's voice drifting out of the barracks that evening. He didn't say anything to anyone about it. He picked Lily up at 17:30, like always listened to her, tell him about a spelling test she'd aced, made her favorite dinner, read 2 chapters of the Dragon Book. But that night, after she was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table with his hands pressed flat against the wood, breathing slow, feeling something inside him strain against its cage for the first time in years. Thursday brought a new recruit into the mix, a private named Owen Bryce, 18 years old, barely out of basic, the kind of kid who still saluted a half-second too enthusiastically and hadn't yet learned which sergeants to avoid. He made the mistake of showing up late to Cole's afternoon combatives session because he'd gotten turned around finding the building. Cole didn't wait for an explanation. You think this is a joke? Private? You think my time doesn't matter? He grabbed the front of Owen's shirt, not quite a punch, not quite restrained either, and shoved him back hard enough that the kid stumbled into the wall. Ethan was passing by with a hand truck of supply crates when he saw it happen through the open door. He stopped. Cole! Cole turned, irritation flashing across his face at the interruption. This isn't your business, Carter. He's 18 years old, and he got lost in a building he's been in for a week. Let him go. Or what? Cole released Owen's shirt but stepped toward Ethan instead, chest out testing. You gonna file a complaint? Go cry to the CO. He laughed short and mean. You're not exactly in a position to lecture anybody about weakness, Carter. Ethan didn't move, didn't blink. I'm not lecturing you. I'm telling you to let the kid go. Something in his voice had changed quieter, but with an edge underneath it that made even Cole pause for half a second, the way a man pauses when he hears a sound he can't quite place. Then Cole shook it off, waved a dismissive hand. Whatever. Get out of my session. He turned back to the recruit's voice, booming again like nothing had happened. Everybody line up. Private Bryce here is going to do extra reps for wasting my time. Ethan lingered a moment longer, watching Owen's face, scared, embarrassed, grateful all at once, before he pushed his hand truck onward down the hallway. He didn't see Owen mouth the words, "Thank you," behind Cole's back. He didn't need to. He already knew what he'd done, and he knew exactly what it would cost him. It cost him by Friday. Cole found him in the supply office that morning alone, door propped open, and closed it behind himself as he stepped inside, a small gesture, but one that made Ethan's guard go up instantly. You made a mistake yesterday, Cole said, voice low now, all performance stripped away, just cold and direct. Undermining me in front of my own recruits. I didn't undermine anything. You were putting your hands on a kid over nothing. That kid needs to learn discipline. That's my job, not yours. Cole stepped closer, close enough that Ethan could see the vein working in his temple. You've been walking around this base for months, acting like you're better than everybody, hiding behind that quiet act, and I am sick of it. You want to protect people so bad? Fine. Protect yourself, because I am done going easy on you. You've never gone easy on me. Cole's jaw tightened. You have no idea what easy looks like, Carter. He turned to leave, then stopped at the door, glancing back with something ugly in his eyes. Enjoy the next few weeks. The door shut hard behind him. Ethan stood alone in the office for a long moment, staring at the closed door, feeling the temperature of the entire situation shift beneath him, like ice cracking on a lake. He'd known somewhere in the back of his mind that stepping in for Owen would have a cost. He hadn't expected the bill to come so fast. The following week became a slow, grinding campaign, each day a little worse than the one before. Monday. Cole rewrote the supply inspection schedule to put Ethan on the most tedious rotations, doubling his workload for no reason anyone could point to on paper. Tuesday, he accidentally left Ethan's name off the roster for a training exercise. Everyone else attended, then made a show of acting confused about it in front of witnesses, letting the implication hang in the air that Ethan simply hadn't been trusted to come. Wednesday was worse. Cole cornered him during a routine gear check, two other instructors present, and made him run through combatives basics, like a green recruit blocking drills, footwork. The most elementary exercises the Army taught, performed slowly and deliberately in front of an audience, clearly meant to humiliate rather than instruct. Again, Cole said after Ethan executed a block that was by any honest measure flawless. Sloppy. Do it again. Ethan did it again. Identical. Still sloppy. Cole's voice carried an edge of real frustration now because some part of him, some instinct he couldn't quite name, sensed that what he was watching didn't add up. Nobody moved that clean by accident. Nobody's footwork looked that settled without years behind it. But he didn't let himself follow that thought anywhere, because the story he'd built about Ethan Carter was too satisfying to abandon. Again. They went 4 more rounds before Cole finally lost interest and walked away muttering something about wasted time. The two watching instructors exchanged a glance. Neither of them commented on out loud, but one of them, a woman named Sergeant Ruiz, lingered a moment after Cole left. "That was clean form, Carter," she said quietly, studying him with new interest. "Where'd you train?" "Long time ago," Ethan said and gathered his gear before she could ask anything else. Thursday brought the video. It started as a joke, the way most cruelty on a base like this did. One recruit filming Cole's PT sessions for his own social media, capturing highlight reels of Cole's flashier moves to post later. He hadn't meant to catch anything involving Ethan. But halfway through Thursday's session, Cole singled Ethan out again, made him hold a plank position, while insulting him for a full 2 minutes in front of the formation, and the recruit filming. It kept the camera rolling, because the moment felt, in his words, later, too crazy not to have on tape. By that night, the clip had made its way around 3 different group chats. By Friday morning, close to 100 people on base had seen it. Ethan's arms shaking, sweat dripping onto the mat, Cole's voice looping the same insults, and underneath it all, the sound of laughter from the recruits standing around him. Marcus showed up at Ethan's door Friday evening, phone in hand, face grim. "You seen this yet?" "Seen what?" Marcus turned the screen toward him without a word. Ethan watched himself on the small rectangle of glass, watched his own face straining, watched Cole circling him like a shark, watched the laughter in the background, and something cold settled into his chest that had nothing to do with embarrassment. "It's got almost 400 views," Marcus said quietly. "On a base with maybe 2,000 people, Ethan. That's not nothing." Ethan handed the phone back without comment. "You gonna say something, report it. This is harassment, plain and simple, and now there's video proof." "And say what?" Ethan's voice came out rougher than he intended. That Cole Mercer, the most decorated combatives instructor on this base, picked on the weakest soldier he could find. Everybody already believes that story, Marcus. The video just confirms it for them. That's not the point. The point, Ethan cut in sharper now than Marcus had ever heard him, is that if I report this, it becomes a whole investigation. Statements, interviews, a paper trail with my name at the center of it. And people start asking questions about my file, about what's actually in there. I can't afford that kind of attention, Marcus. Not with Lily. Marcus studied him for a long moment, something clicking into place behind his eyes. "You're not scared of Cole," he said slowly. "You're scared of what happens if people find out who you actually are." Ethan didn't answer, which was answer enough. "Ethan." Marcus's voice softened. "Whatever you did before, whatever's in that file, it doesn't erase who you are now. A good father, a patient man. Nobody's going to look at that file and think less of you for protecting your daughter. You don't know that." Ethan's jaw was tight. "The Army doesn't forget what a man used to be capable of. Once they know, they start finding reasons to use it again. Deployments, special assignments, and every single one of those is a chance I don't come home." He looked up, and there was something almost pleading in his eyes now, a crack in the composure Marcus had never once seen. "I already lost Lily's mother to this life once. I am not gambling with being the only parent she has left." Marcus sat with that for a long moment, the weight of it settling over both of them. Finally, he nodded, slow and reluctant. "Okay, I hear you. But Ethan, a man can only take so much. You know that better than anybody. And Cole is not going to stop. Not now. That video's out there. He's going to keep pushing because he thinks he's found something that can't push back. Then let him think that. And if he pushes too far?" Ethan didn't have an answer for that. Neither of them did. The following Monday, something in the atmosphere on base had shifted, subtle but unmistakable. More eyes followed Ethan through the hallways, now some sympathetic, most simply curious, treating him like a character in a story, rather than a man doing his job. Recruits who'd never spoken to him before started nodding at him in the mess hall, not mockingly, but almost apologetically, like they'd started to sense something wasn't right about what they'd been laughing at for weeks. Cole noticed the shift too, and it seemed to feed something hungry and unstable in him, rather than cool it off. He found new ways to escalate. Small ones at first, reassigning Ethan to inventory duty during the coldest hours of early morning, accidentally scheduling him for back-to-back shifts, making snide comments in passing that were technically not insults, but landed exactly the same. Then midweek, he crossed a line that even some of his own instructors found uncomfortable. He brought Lily into it directly. It happened during a formation run. Cole jogging alongside Ethan just close enough to talk without the rest of the group clearly hearing. "You know what they're gonna say about your daughter when she's older, right?" Cole's breathing was steady controlled while Ethan's stayed level through sheer discipline. "Kids at school. Once she's old enough to understand what people say about her old man. Weakest soldier on the base. You think that doesn't follow a kid around?" Ethan's stride faltered for half a step before he caught himself. "I'm just saying." Cole continued, voice light, almost friendly, which somehow made it worse. "You might want to think about what kind of example you're setting. Because right now the example is when a man pushes you around, you just take it. Is that really what you want her learning from you? Leave her out of this. I'm not the one who brought a kid onto a military base as a single father, Carter. That was you." Cole picked up his pace, pulling ahead, calling back over his shoulder with a grin. "Just something to think about." Ethan finished the run in silence, staring straight ahead, feeling something in his chest twist tighter with every step. That night, after Lily fell asleep in the middle of a sentence about her friend's new puppy, Ethan sat by her bed for a long while, just watching her breathe, feeling the full weight of every promise he'd made, pressing down on him at once. He didn't sleep much that night. By the second week of the campaign, the tension on base had become something almost tangible, the kind of pressure people could sense, even if they couldn't name it. Danny Cruz started keeping a quiet, unofficial tally of every incident, a habit he'd picked up, without quite deciding to jotting dates and details into the Notes app on his phone just in case. He mentioned it to Ethan once, half apologetic. "I don't know why I'm doing it," he admitted. "Just feels like somebody should be keeping track." "Keep doing it," Ethan said quietly, surprising him. "Just in case." "In case of what?" Ethan didn't answer that. He didn't have to. Something in his eyes told Danny that even Ethan himself didn't fully know what he was bracing for, only that he could feel it coming. The way you feel, a storm shift the air pressure hours before the first drop of rain. Wednesday of that week brought the closest thing yet to a breaking point, though nobody watching knew it at the time. Cole had organized a joint training session between his combatives class and a group of new recruits fresh out of basic, eager and nervous in equal measure. Among them was a young woman named Private Alicia Chen, barely 5 months into her enlistment, clearly overwhelmed by Cole's aggressive teaching style from the very first drill. When she fumbled a takedown attempt for the third time, Cole lost patience entirely. "You're gonna get someone killed moving like that," he snapped, grabbing her by the shoulder and shoving her back into position hard enough that she stumbled and nearly fell. Again, and this time, actually try. Alicia's eyes welled up, humiliation and fear tangled together, and she froze completely, unable to make herself move. "I said again," Cole barked, stepping toward her. Ethan was across the gym doing inventory checks on training equipment, and he didn't consciously decide to cross the floor. His feet simply carried him there before his mind caught up. "That's enough, Cole." The whole room turned. Cole's face twisted with something close to triumph, like he'd finally gotten exactly what he'd been fishing for all these weeks. "You want to step in again, Carter? Really?" He let go of Alicia, who backed away quickly, chest heaving. "You just can't help yourself, can you? Every single time." "She's scared and you're making it worse. That's not training, that's just cruelty." "And what would you know about training?" Cole's voice rose, playing to the room now the way he always did. "You've spent your whole career shuffling paperwork. You don't get to lecture me about how to build soldiers." "I'm not lecturing you about soldiers." Ethan's voice stayed low steady, but something underneath it had hardened, something the whole room could feel even if they couldn't identify it. "I'm telling you to stop putting your hands on people half your size who are too scared to say no." The gym had gone completely silent now, every recruit watching phones already starting to come out of pockets on instinct, sensing something was about to happen. Cole's jaw worked, anger flashing hot and sudden across his face, and for one long charged moment, it looked like he might actually swing. Then just as quickly, he caught himself, some flicker of self-control or calculation pulling him back from the edge. He forced a laugh instead, cold and performative. You know what, Carter, fine. You want to keep playing hero, keep doing it. Sooner or later, even a broken clock is right, so I guess congratulations, you found your moment. He turned to Alicia, voice suddenly deliberately gentle in a way that felt worse than his shouting. Go sit down, Private. Apparently we've got a new instructor today. He walked off towards the equipment rack, and the room slowly exhaled tension bleeding out of it in pieces. Alicia mouthed a silent thank you toward Ethan before hurrying off the mat, and Ethan stood there a moment longer, breathing hard, despite not having moved, feeling the weight of 50 pairs of eyes on him in a way that felt entirely different from every other time this had happened. For the first time in weeks, some of those eyes weren't laughing, but Cole's weren't among them, and later that night from across the gym, one instructor would swear they saw something pass over Cole Mercer's face as he watched Ethan walk away. Something that looked less like anger and more like a decision being made. That decision arrived 3 days later on a Friday evening PT session that would end up being recorded by more than 50 phones before it was over. The session started ordinary enough. Combatives drills, partner rotations, Cole moving through the formation, correcting form with his usual mix of genuine instruction and casual cruelty. Ethan had been paired almost certainly, not by accident, directly across from Cole for a demonstration rotation. All right. Cole clapped his hands, addressing the group but staring directly at Ethan. Since Sergeant Carter's been so eager to jump into other people's business lately, let's give him a turn in the spotlight. Show everybody what real training looks like. A ripple of unease moved through the recruits. Some of them had started to sense over the past weeks that something about this dynamic had shifted into dangerous territory, though none of them had the rank or the nerve to say so out loud. I'm not looking for a spotlight, Ethan said quietly. Too bad. Cole's grin had an edge to it now that hadn't been there in earlier weeks, something harder, hungrier. Get on the mat. Ethan hesitated only a second before stepping forward, because refusing outright in front of this many witnesses would only feed the narrative Cole had spent months building. He told himself he could get through this the way he'd gotten through everything else. Absorb it. Give nothing back. Walk away. He miscalculated how far Cole intended to take it. Basic clinch position, Cole announced to the group, stepping close to Ethan, hands finding his shoulders in a demonstration hold. Now, in a real scenario, if your opponent tries to break away, without warning, without any buildup that could be mistaken for accident, Cole shoved him. Hard. Both hands driving into Ethan's chest with real force, no restraint in it at all, sending him stumbling backward off balance. Ethan's foot caught the edge of the mat, and he went down, hitting the floor with a heavy, echoing thud that silenced every conversation in the gym instantly. For a full second, nobody moved. Then Cole started laughing. Whoa! He spread his hands wide, playing to the crowd delight written across every feature. Guess he really can't hold his footing. He looked around at the recruits, several of whom had already raised their phones, capturing every second without quite realizing what they were about to witness. This is why weak men don't belong here. The words landed in the silent gym like a verdict. Ethan lay there for a beat longer than necessary, staring up at the same fluorescent lights he'd been staring at for weeks in his own private nightmares, feeling something inside him go very, very still. Not defeated, not broken, but still in the way the ocean goes, still right before it pulls back to build a wave. Danny Cruz, standing near the back of the formation, felt his stomach drop. He'd been filming almost everyone had by then, the way phones instinctively rise whenever something feels like it's about to become a story. And through his own screen, he watched Ethan slowly push himself up onto one elbow, then the other, then finally to his feet, dusting himself off with a stillness that felt entirely wrong for the moment. Not humiliated stillness. Something else. Cole was still grinning, still playing to the room, utterly oblivious to the shift happening 3 feet in front of him. Anyway, he said, turning back to the recruits like the moment was already over, already forgotten. That's what happens when you don't respect the fundamentals. All right, next pair. Cole. The single word cut through the gym with a weight none of Ethan's previous silences had ever carried. Cole turned, still smiling, still certain of exactly what kind of man he was dealing with. What, Carter? You want to go again? Because I promise you, it's going to end the same way. Ethan didn't answer right away. He stood there in the center of the mat, 50 phones still raised around him, 50 pairs of eyes waiting to see what the weakest soldier on the base would do next. And something in his expression had changed so completely that even Danny, watching through his phone screen, felt a chill move down his spine without understanding why. Cole's smile faltered, just slightly. Just for a fraction of a second, the first genuine flicker of uncertainty anyone had ever seen cross his face in Ethan Carter's presence. Then, just as quickly, he covered it with a laugh, waved a dismissive hand, and turned back to the formation like nothing at all had happened. But something had, and whatever line existed between the man Ethan Carter had promised to become and the man he used to be, the man buried under 6 years of silence, 6 years of walking away, 6 years of choosing his daughter over everything he used to be capable of, had just cracked wide enough that even Cole Mercer, oblivious as he was, could feel the ground shifting beneath his own feet. He just didn't understand yet what he'd woken up. The video from that Friday session didn't just spread through the base. It exploded. By Saturday morning, it had been shared into 6 different group chats, stitched together from 4 separate angles. Someone had even added slow-motion replay of the moment Ethan hit the mat. By Sunday, soldiers from 2 other units on base had seen it. The caption someone attached to the most shared version read simply, "Weakest Dad in the Army Part 2." Ethan didn't see any of it himself. He didn't need to. He could read it in the way people looked at him differently that weekend. Some with pity, some with open amusement, a few, a small but growing few, with something that looked almost like guilt. Danny Cruz found him Sunday afternoon at the base playground, watching Lily climb the jungle gym, with the particular stillness of a father who needed exactly this, exactly now more than anything else in the world. "Sergeant." Danny approached carefully, like he wasn't sure if he was welcome. "You got a minute?" Ethan didn't take his eyes off Lily. "What is it? Cruz?" Danny hesitated, phone in his pocket, suddenly feeling heavier than it should. "The video's everywhere. I wanted you to hear it from me before you heard it some other way." "I know. You know." Danny blinked. "You've seen it. I don't need to see it, Cruz. I felt it." Ethan finally turned to look at him, and there was something exhausted in his eyes that went deeper than physical tiredness. "Doesn't matter how many angles they've got, it happened. That part's not up for debate. It's not right. What he did to you, that wasn't training, that was assault, and everybody with eyes knows it. Guys are starting to say so, actually. I heard 2 privates arguing about it in the chow line this morning. Not everybody thinks it's funny anymore." That caught Ethan's attention, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. "Some people are saying that more than you'd think." Danny shifted his weight, working up to something. "Sergeant, can I ask you something? And I need you to actually answer me this time, not just brush it off." Ethan waited. "Why do you let him keep going? I've watched you take stuff for weeks that would have made most men snap in the first 5 minutes. You're not scared of him. I don't buy that. Not after what I saw in the equipment room. Not after what I saw the way you carry yourself. So what is it?" Ethan was quiet for a long moment, watching Lily hang upside down from the monkey bars, giggling at nothing, blissfully unaware that half the base had spent the weekend laughing at a video of her father hitting the floor. "You ever make a promise to somebody you loved?" Ethan finally said. "Knowing it was going to cost you. Knowing every single day you kept it was going to hurt a little." "I don't know. Maybe. I made one." Ethan's voice was low, almost private, though there was nobody else close enough to hear. "A long time ago. To somebody I lost. And keeping that promise means eating things like Friday and walking away instead of doing what my body's been trained to do since before you were old enough to shave." He looked at Danny directly now. "That's not weakness, Cruz. Whatever this base thinks it saw on that mat, that wasn't a man who couldn't fight back. That was a man choosing not to. Danny stared at him, something shifting behind his eyes, pieces starting to click together that he couldn't yet fully name. Choosing not to. He repeated slowly. Sergeant, what exactly did you do before supply? Ethan didn't answer that. He just looked back toward the jungle gym toward Lily, and the conversation ended there, the way it always did whenever anyone got too close to the truth he'd buried. But Danny walked away that afternoon with a feeling in his gut. He couldn't shake the sense that he'd just brushed up against something enormous. Something the whole base had been laughing at without any idea what it actually was. Monday brought consequences neither of them expected. Captain Reyes, the company commander, called Ethan into his office first thing in the morning, and for one cold second, Ethan's mind went to every worst-case scenario, an investigation into his file questions about his past. The exact conversation he'd spent 6 years avoiding. Instead, Reyes gestured him into a chair with something like discomfort on his face. I saw the video, Sergeant Carter. Ethan kept his expression neutral. Sir, I want to be straightforward with you. Reyes leaned back, rubbing a hand over his jaw. What happened on that mat Friday should not have happened. Sergeant Mercer used excessive force in a training exercise, and that's a problem, regardless of anything else going on between the two of you. I appreciate that, sir. But Reyes held up a hand before Ethan could feel any relief. Sergeant Mercer has an outstanding record. 3 regional titles. He's brought more recruits through combatives certification than any instructor on this base in the past 5 years. If I open a formal investigation off the back of one video without a direct complaint from you, it's going to be a mess for him, for the unit, and frankly for you too, given how this base already talks. Ethan understood immediately what was being asked of him. You're not going to do anything. I didn't say that. Reyes's jaw tightened, clearly uncomfortable with his own position. I'm going to have a conversation with him, off the record. Make it clear that behavior like that will not be tolerated again. He paused. But if you want this handled formally, Sergeant Carter, you need to file a complaint yourself. I can't do that on your behalf, not without your statement. Ethan sat with that for a long moment. Filing a complaint meant a paper trail. It meant interviews, statements, maybe even a records review that could pull threads he'd spent years keeping tucked away. It meant risking everything to fix a problem he still somewhere deep down believed he could handle himself. I don't want to file anything, sir. Reyes studied him. Something like disappointment and relief mixed together on his face. Relief that the mess wouldn't land on his desk. Disappointment in a system that let it get this far in the first place. All right, I'll speak with Mercer. But Sergeant Carter... He leaned forward, voice dropping into something more sincere. If this continues, I want you to know my door is open. This isn't something you have to just absorb. Understood, sir. Thank you. Ethan left the office feeling no better than when he'd walked in. Whatever conversation Reyes had with Cole that Monday afternoon, it didn't shrink him. If anything, it seemed to sharpen him like a blade taken to a whetstone. Cole spent the rest of the week radiating a kind of coiled resentment that everyone on base could feel, even those who had no idea a private conversation with the commander had taken place. He didn't touch Ethan again, not physically, not for the rest of that week. But he found other ways. He started making comments about Lily more often. Casual, almost conversational, dropped into passing moments where nobody else could quite call it out as harassment. Hope your kid's got a backup plan for a father figure. Must be rough for a little girl growing up watching her old man get pushed around. Small cuts, each one landing exactly where Cole knew it would hurt most, each one calculated to stay just short of anything Ethan could formally report. Wednesday. Ethan came home to find Lily upset. Tears streaked down her face, refusing to explain what was wrong until he sat with her for 20 minutes, coaxing it out gently. Some kids at daycare were talking about you, she finally admitted, voice small. They said their dad said you got beat up, that you're not a real soldier. Ethan's chest went tight, a rage so pure and sudden it frightened him with how fast it arrived. He kept his voice steady, kept his hands from shaking, and pulled his daughter into his lap. "Baby girl, listen to me." He tilted her chin up gently so she'd look at him. "What other kids say, what their parents say, that doesn't decide who I am. You know who I am. You know how I love you, how hard I work, how I show up for you every single day. That's the truth. Everything else is just noise." "But they were laughing," Lily said, and something in her small voice cracked in a way that broke something in Ethan far worse than any insult Cole had ever thrown directly at him. "I didn't know what to say. I didn't want them to be mean to you." "You don't have to defend me, sweetheart. That's not your job. Your job is just to be a kid. Let me worry about the rest." She nodded against his chest, and he held her there long after she'd stopped crying, staring at the wall over her head with an expression that had anyone from the gym seen it in that moment would have terrified them. That night, after Lily was finally asleep, Ethan sat on the edge of his bed and did something he hadn't done in over a year. He pulled his phone out and scrolled to a contact he'd saved, but never called a name from a life he'd tried to leave behind. Sergeant Major Wallace retired. His old training officer, the man who'd once told him he had the fastest hands he'd ever coached in 22 years of service. He typed a message, deleted it, typed it again. "Been a long time. Something's come up. Could use some advice if you've got time." He didn't send it. He sat there staring at the screen for 10 full minutes before finally closing the phone and setting it face down on the nightstand. The old instinct to keep everything buried winning out one more time, even as some deeper part of him understood that the ground was shifting beneath his feet, whether he acknowledged it or not. Thursday, something unexpected happened. Sergeant Ruiz, the instructor who'd noticed Ethan's clean form during that combative session 2 weeks earlier, approached him privately in the supply office. "Can I say something to you, Carter, off the record?" Ethan set down the clipboard he'd been holding. "Go ahead. I've been in this army 12 years. I've trained under some of the best combatives instructors in the country." Ruiz leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, studying him carefully. "I've also spent enough time around genuinely dangerous people to recognize the difference between somebody who's never fought and somebody who's spent years pretending they haven't." Ethan's expression didn't change, but something in his posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. "That block you threw during Mercer's session," Ruiz continued, "that wasn't beginner's luck. That was muscle memory built over years of real training, real repetition, probably real combat. I don't know what your story is, Carter, and honestly, it's none of my business. But I want you to know, some of us see it. We're just waiting to understand why a man with hands like that is letting himself get pushed around by somebody half as capable." Ethan was quiet for a long moment. "It's complicated. Most important things are." Ruiz straightened up, offering something that wasn't quite a smile, but wasn't unfriendly either. "Just know you've got at least one person on this base who doesn't buy the story everybody else is telling about you." She left before he could respond, and Ethan sat alone with that for a long time afterward, feeling for the first time in weeks like maybe not every set of eyes on this base was looking at him the same way. The reprieve didn't last. Friday brought Cole back into full force, as if the week's restraint had only been building pressure that needed somewhere to go. He caught Ethan during the evening formation in front of nearly the entire company gathered for a scheduled unit briefing, and made no effort to keep his voice down. "You know, Carter, I heard you had a nice little chat with the CO on Monday." Cole's tone was casual, conversational, deadly. "Didn't file a complaint, though. Interesting choice. Almost like there's something in that file of yours you don't want anybody looking at too closely." Ethan's pulse spiked, but his face stayed carefully blank. "What's the matter?" Cole pressed, sensing something and leaning into it the way a shark leans into blood in the water. "Got something to hide, Sergeant Carter? Some skeleton back there behind all that supply paperwork." "I don't have anything to say to you, Cole. You never do." Cole's grin widened, cruel and satisfied. "That's the thing about you. You never have anything to say. Just walk away over and over, let everybody believe whatever they want." "You know what I think? I think there's nothing there at all. I think you're exactly what you look like, a washed-up nobody who got lucky enough to marry somebody, had a kid, and now hides behind that kid every time somebody asks him to actually prove something. The mention of Sarah, even indirect, even wrapped in an insult, meant for Ethan, and not aimed at her. Memory specifically still landed like a blade twisting somewhere under his ribs. His jaw tightened. His hands at his sides curled slowly into fists before he forced them open again. Cole saw it. Of course he saw it. And instead of backing off, he leaned in harder, sensing weakness the way predators always do. "What did I hit a nerve, the dead wife thing?" His voice dropped into something almost gentle, almost sympathetic, which made it so much worse. "I heard about that, around base. Must be rough. Losing your wife, ending up alone with a kid, and then coming here and getting humiliated every single day on top of it." He shook his head slowly, mockingly. "Honestly, Carter, I almost feel bad for you. Almost." Ethan's breathing had gone shallow, controlled the way it did right before something in him threatened to break loose. Around them, the formation had gone dead silent, every soldier present recognizing they were witnessing something that had crossed a line even Cole hadn't dared cross before. "That's enough, Cole," a voice called out Sergeant Ruiz, stepping forward from the edge of the formation, her voice sharp with warning. Cole ignored her entirely, eyes locked on Ethan. "You gonna say something now? Or are you just gonna stand there and take it same as always?" Ethan looked at him for a long, long moment. Something passed behind his eyes. Not rage, not yet, but the ghost of it. A warning shot fired from somewhere deep inside him that even he seemed startled by. "Walk away, Cole," he said, voice low and even. "While you still can." For half a second, something in that tone actually made Cole hesitate. A flicker of the same uncertainty that had crossed his face after the shove 2 weeks earlier. But pride or stupidity, or simple momentum, carried him forward anyway. Or what? Cole laughed, breaking the tension, playing it off for the crowd one more time. "Relax, everybody. I'm just messing with him. He knows I don't mean anything by it." He clapped Ethan hard on the shoulder, a gesture that looked friendly and felt like anything but, and walked off toward the barracks. Ethan stood there in the formation, breathing slow, deliberate breaths, while around him the murmurs started, quiet ones this time, uneasy ones. Soldiers exchanging glances that suggested even they understood something fundamental had shifted in the past 60 seconds. Sergeant Ruiz approached him afterward, voice low. "You all right, Carter?" "I'm fine. You didn't look fine a second ago." She studied him carefully. "Whatever that thing was, I saw pass over your face. I've seen that look exactly twice before in my career. Both times it ended with somebody in the hospital." Ethan didn't respond to that. He just nodded. Once gathered his gear and walked away the same as always. Though everyone who watched him go that evening swore later that his walk was different somehow. Heavier, more deliberate, like a man carrying something he'd finally stopped trying to set down. Saturday morning, Ethan finally sent the message he'd typed and deleted 3 separate times that week. "Been a long time. Something's come up. Could use some advice if you've got time." The response came back within 20 minutes. "Carter, good to hear from you. Whatever it is, call me tonight. I'll pick up." That evening, after Lily was asleep, Ethan sat on his back step, with the phone pressed to his ear, listening to the familiar gravel of Wallace's voice for the first time in over a year. "Talk to me, son. You don't reach out unless something's wrong." Ethan explained it slowly, haltingly at first, then faster once the dam broke. The humiliation, the video, the growing pressure, the comments about Lily, the promise he'd made Sarah, the fear of what happened if the truth about his past came out. Wallace listened without interrupting, the way he always had back when Ethan was 26 years old and learning how to survive things most men never had to imagine. When Ethan finally finished, there was a long silence on the line. "You know what your problem is, Carter?" Wallace finally said, voice gruff but not unkind. "You've spent 6 years so afraid of becoming a certain kind of man that you've let yourself become a punching bag instead. That's not honoring your wife's memory. That's not what she asked you for. She asked me to raise Lily soft, not violent. There's a difference, son, between violence and protection. You know that better than almost anybody alive. A man who protects the people around him, who steps in when a bully's got his hands on a kid half his size, That's not the man you promised her you wouldn't become. That's exactly the man she married. Ethan sat with that for a long moment, staring out at the dark feeling. Something in his chest loosened slightly, for the first time in weeks. So, what do I do? You keep doing what you've been doing, Wallace said. You keep your discipline. You don't go looking for a fight. But son, if that man ever puts his hands on you again, or on a kid you're sworn to protect, or God forbid, he ever comes at your daughter with his mouth the way it sounds like he's been circling you, stop holding back. You hear me? There's no promise on earth that requires you to let a bully break you in front of your own child's memory of you. The words settled into Ethan like something long overdue. Thank you, he said quietly. Don't thank me. Just don't let that man make you forget who you actually are. A pause, then gentler. How's Lily? She's good. She's the best part of every single day. Good. Wallace's voice softened further. Sarah would be proud of the man you've become, Ethan. Don't let anybody convince you otherwise. Not even yourself. They talked a while longer. Old memories, old names, before finally saying goodbye. Ethan sat outside long after the call ended, staring up at a sky full of stars, feeling something inside him settle into place after 6 long years of being buried. He didn't know it yet, but the final piece had just clicked into position. The only thing left now was the moment that would force it into the open. That moment arrived the following Tuesday, and it arrived exactly the way these things always seem to on this base in front of everyone, with no warning at all. The whole company had gathered in the gym for an end-of-cycle assessment. Nearly 80 soldiers packed into the bleachers and along the walls brass from 2 other units present to observe. Cole was running the final combatives demonstration, showing off in front of an audience larger than usual, riding high on the kind of attention he lived for. Ethan had come to observe standing near the back, with Danny Cruz and a small group from the supply office, trying to blend into the crowd the way he always tried to. It should have been simple. It should have ended without incident. Then Lily walked in. She wasn't supposed to be there. Daycare pickup had run late, and the sitter who normally covered the gap had called in sick. So Marcus had brought her by on his way to find Ethan, thinking he'd just quietly collect his daughter and slip out before anyone noticed. 6-year-old backpack slung over one shoulder, she spotted her father across the crowded gym and without any concept of timing or consequence called out, "Daddy!" The word cut across the gym in the gap between drills and every head turned. Ethan's stomach dropped as he watched his daughter start making her way through the crowd toward him, small and bright amid a sea of uniforms, utterly unaware of what she'd just walked into. Cole, standing at the center of the mat, turned too. And something in his expression shifted the moment he saw her recognition. Then something colder. Something that made Ethan's blood run instantly cold. "Well, would you look at that?" Cole said loud enough for the whole gym to hear a slow grin spreading across his face. "Speak of the devil. This must be the famous daughter." "Cole." Ethan's voice was low, urgent, already moving toward Lily. "Don't." "Don't what?" Cole spread his hands innocently, playing to the crowd the way he always did. Except now there was something reckless in it. Something that had abandoned every last boundary he'd previously respected. "I'm just saying hello, sweetheart." He crouched slightly, addressing Lily directly, as she stopped confused halfway across the gym floor. "You know your daddy's the weakest soldier on this whole base. Ask anybody here. Go on, ask them." A ripple of discomfort moved through the crowd. Even soldiers who'd laughed at every previous insult felt this one land wrong, felt it cross into territory that didn't belong in a room full of adults, let alone in front of a child. "Cole, that's enough." Sergeant Ruiz snapped from somewhere near the mat, but he didn't stop. "No, really?" Cole continued, straightening up, voice carrying easily across the silent gym, eyes fixed on Ethan now with something ugly and triumphant in them. "Your dad's a failure, sweetheart. Ask anybody. Weakest man on this base. Can't even stand up for himself, let alone, that's my daughter." The words came out of Ethan low and quiet, but they cut through the gym like a blade through silk, and every single person present felt the temperature of the room drop by 20 degrees in an instant. Cole turned, still grinning, still riding whatever reckless wave had carried him this far. "I know exactly who she is, Carter. That's the point. That's exactly the point I'm making. A little girl growing up watching her father get pushed around by every man on this base, and there's not a single thing you can do about it. Because you're too weak. You've always been too weak." Something in Ethan's face changed then completely irrevocably, in a way that made Marcus, standing frozen near the doorway, with a hand protectively on Lily's shoulder, take an involuntary step backward. Ethan walked forward. Not fast, not aggressive, just steady, deliberate steps carrying him across the gym floor toward the mat. And something about the stillness of it, the absolute silence radiating off him, made the entire room fall quiet in a way no shouted order ever could have achieved. "Ethan." Marcus's voice urgent from the doorway. "You don't have to. Take Lily outside, Marcus." "Ethan, take her outside, now." His voice never rose above a murmur, but the command in it was absolute, undeniable. Marcus hesitated only a second before scooping Lily up despite her protests, carrying her toward the door, as she twisted to look back over his shoulder, confused and frightened by whatever was happening to the air in that room. Cole watched all of this with a grin still plastered across his face, utterly failing to register the shift happening in front of him, still convinced he was standing at the center of a joke only he understood. "Look at that," he said to the crowd, spreading his arms wide. "Getting all worked up. What are you gonna do? Carter finally gonna get on the mat?" The words landed flat, final, absolute. The whole gym seemed to inhale at once. Cole blinked, genuinely startled for the first time in weeks. "What? You heard me?" Ethan stepped onto the mat, rolling his shoulders once loose and easy, an economy of motion that suddenly, inexplicably, looked nothing like the stumbling, exhausted man who'd hit the floor 2 weeks earlier. "Get on the mat." A murmur exploded through the crowd. Phones rising instinctively into the air on every side of the gym. 80 soldiers and 3 visiting officers, all sensing simultaneously that they were about to witness something none of them would ever forget. Cole recovered his composure fast, forcing the grin back onto his face, though something underneath it had gone slightly unsteady. "You serious? You want to do this in front of everybody? You've spent months doing this to me in front of everybody," Ethan said, voice perfectly calm, perfectly level. "Seems only fair." Cole laughed short and sharp, glancing around at the crowd for support that felt suddenly noticeably thinner than it had a moment ago. All right, fine. You want a lesson, old man? I'll give you one." He stepped onto the mat across from Ethan, rolling his neck, shaking out his hands, every motion performed for the benefit of the watching crowd. Ethan simply stood there, feet planted, hands loose at his sides, breathing slow and even, eyes locked on Cole, with an intensity that finally seemed to register as something other than weakness. "Last chance to walk away, Carter," Cole said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier bravado. "I'm done walking away." The gym fell into absolute silence. Cole moved first, exactly as everyone expected. Fast-aggressive, a flashy combination meant to end things quickly and humiliate his opponent in front of the largest audience he'd ever performed for. A jab feinting toward the head. A low kick aimed at the thigh. Ethan didn't flinch. He watched the jab arrive and simply wasn't where it landed. Weight shifted a fraction of an inch, and Cole's fist swept through empty air. The kick came next, and Ethan's leg caught it, absorbed it, redirected it with a small, economical motion that looked almost lazy, almost bored. A ripple of confusion moved through the crowd. This wasn't what anyone had expected. Cole's eyes flickered surprise, breaking through his confidence for just a fraction of a second, and he pressed forward harder, a combination this time. 3 strikes thrown in rapid succession, each one carrying real power, real intent to end this fast and decisively. Ethan slipped the first, deflected the second with a motion so small it barely registered as movement at all. The third he caught entirely, his hand closing around Cole's wrist mid-strike with a speed that made half the room gasp audibly. For one suspended second, the 2 men stood frozen. Cole's arm locked in Ethan's grip, both of them staring at each other, and something passed across Cole's face that hadn't been there in any of their previous encounters. Fear. "Let go," Cole said, voice suddenly tight. Ethan didn't answer. He simply moved. What happened next took less than 3 seconds. Though every single person in that gym would later describe it as though time itself had slowed to a crawl. Ethan's grip on Cole's wrist became leverage, his body pivoting with an efficiency that spoke of thousands of repetitions performed in a life nobody in that room had ever glimpsed. Cole's balance broke instantly, his feet leaving the ground for a fraction of a second before he hit the mat with a heavy, echoing crash that silenced the last murmurs in the crowd entirely. Before Cole could even process what had happened, Ethan was down with him. Weight-settled position, locked, an arm wrapped beneath Cole's chin in a hold so clean and so immediate that it looked almost gentle from a distance, though everyone close enough could see Cole's face rapidly shifting. Color could see his hands scrabbling uselessly against Ethan's forearm. "Tap," Ethan said, voice quiet, almost kind. "Or I don't let go." Cole's hand slapped against the mat once, twice, a third time desperate when Ethan didn't immediately release him. Only then did Ethan let go, rising smoothly to his feet and stepping back, leaving Cole gasping and coughing on the mat below him. The strongest man on the base, reduced in front of 80 witnesses and 3 officers and 100 raised phone cameras to exactly the kind of helpless figure he'd spent months making Ethan look like. The gym remained utterly, completely silent. Nobody laughed. Nobody moved. Ethan stood over him for one final moment, breathing steady expression, unreadable, before he turned and walked toward the door, where Marcus and Lily were standing, frozen, having witnessed every single second of it through the gym's glass window. He didn't look back at Cole. He didn't need to. Behind him on the mat, Cole Mercer lay coughing, staring up at the same fluorescent lights Ethan had stared at weeks earlier, utterly, completely silent for the first time since anyone on that base had ever known him. While 80 phones, still raised, still recording, captured the moment the entire story of Ethan Carter was about to change forever. The gym doors swung shut behind Ethan, but the silence he'd left behind didn't stay contained. It followed him out into the hallway, into the parking lot, into the following 72 hours that would tear the entire base apart and put it back together in a shape nobody recognized. Marcus was still holding Lily when Ethan reached them, her small arms wrapped tight around his neck, confusion written across her face. "Daddy, what happened? Why is everybody so quiet?" Ethan took her from Marcus without a word, pressing his lips to the top of her head, feeling his own pulse finally starting to slow. "Everything's okay, baby girl. Everything's okay." But that man on the floor, he's okay too. He just needed to sit down for a minute. Ethan's voice stayed gentle, steady, giving nothing away of what had just happened, of what his body had just done after 6 years of silence. "You hungry? Let's go get some dinner." Marcus stared at him like he was looking at a stranger wearing a familiar face. "Ethan, what in God's name was that?" "Not now, Marcus. Not now, you just..." Marcus caught himself glancing at Lily, lowering his voice. "You just put the base's top combatives instructor to sleep in front of 80 people and 100 cameras. There is no not now." "I know." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I know exactly what I just did. I'll deal with it. Right now, I need to get my daughter fed and settled, and then I'll deal with whatever comes next." Marcus studied him a moment longer, something between awe and worry in his expression, then nodded slowly. "All right, go. I'll call you tonight." Ethan carried Lily to the car, buckled her in, and drove off base to a diner. They both loved the kind of place with red vinyl booths and a jukebox nobody ever used anymore. He let her order pancakes for dinner, something he never allowed on a school night, and he sat across from her watching her talk about butterflies and spelling tests, and a boy in her class who claimed he could burp the alphabet, and for 1 hour, he let himself exist entirely outside of what had just happened in that gym. He didn't check his phone once. He didn't need to know yet how many times that video had already been shared. He would find out soon enough. By the time he got Lily home, bathed and tucked into bed, His phone had 31 missed calls and over 200 text messages. He sat on the edge of his bed and finally opened it, and what he found made his stomach drop in a way 3 seconds on a mat never had. The video was everywhere. Not just on base group chats now. It had escaped posted to a public military meme page with over 400,000 followers, already sitting at close to 2 million views within 6 hours. The caption read, "Bully instructor gets exactly what he deserves. Watch till the end." Comments poured in by the thousands. Veterans, active duty soldiers from bases across the country, civilians who'd never worn a uniform in their lives, all of them dissecting those 3 seconds frame by frame, all of them asking the same question. Who is this guy Marcus called at 9? You seeing this? I'm seeing it. Ethan, this isn't just base gossip anymore. This is national. People are asking your name. Somebody already found your rank and unit from the patch on your uniform in the video. Marcus's voice carried a mix of disbelief and something almost like fear. This is not going away quietly. I know. Do you? Because in about 6 hours, somebody's gonna connect enough dots to figure out you're not just a supply sergeant who got lucky. People who actually know combatives are already all over this thing, breaking down your footwork, your grip, the way you read his strikes before he even threw them. There's a whole thread comparing you to special operations training. Ethan closed his eyes. Let them talk. Let them. Marcus stopped himself, exhaling hard. All right, I hear you. Just be ready. Whatever's in that file of yours, it's not staying buried much longer. He wasn't wrong. The next morning, Ethan was called into Captain Reyes's office before he'd even finished his coffee. This time, the atmosphere in the room was entirely different from their previous conversation. Reyes sat behind his desk with 3 separate devices open in front of him, each one playing some version of the same video on a loop, muted. Sit down, Sergeant Carter. Ethan sat. I've had 4 phone calls this morning from people above my pay grade. Reyes rubbed his temples, looking like a man who hadn't slept much. Battalion commander, someone from public affairs, and this. He turned one of the screens toward Ethan. Someone from personnel records asking me why a logistics NCO's takedown technique is being analyzed by 3 separate combat sports channels, as in, I'm quoting here, textbook Special Forces close quarters methodology. Ethan said nothing. You want to tell me what's going on, Carter? Because I've had you on this base for going on 3 years, and not once did anything in your file suggest you were capable of what's on this video. With respect, sir, my file says exactly what it's supposed to say. Reyes's eyebrows lifted slightly. Meaning what? Meaning there are parts of my service record that aren't accessible at your clearance level, sir. That's not me being difficult. That's just how it was structured when I transferred to this assignment. Reyes leaned back slowly, processing that the pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known he was looking at, finally starting to form a picture. You're telling me you've got a classified service history? I'm telling you I can't discuss it, sir. For a long moment, Reyes just studied him, and Ethan could see something shifting in the man's expression. Not anger, but a kind of dawning realization layered with something close to embarrassment. 6 weeks, he said slowly. 6 weeks I watched that man humiliate you in front of this entire company, and I did next to nothing about it because I thought... He stopped himself, shook his head. Doesn't matter what I thought. I should have shut it down the first time I heard about it. You didn't know, sir. I should have looked harder. Reyes sat forward again, all business now. Here's where we stand. Sergeant Mercer sustained no lasting physical injury, but there's no version of this where he walks away from what happened without consequences, especially now that the video's public and half the internet is calling for his head. I've already got Judge Advocate involved. There's going to be a formal review of him and of the pattern of behavior leading up to Friday. Multiple witnesses have already come forward independent of you. Witnesses. Cruz filed a statement first thing this morning. So did Private Bryce, Private Chen. Even a couple of instructors, Ruiz, filed something detailed enough that it's going to matter a great deal in this review. Reyes slid a folder across the desk. This isn't just about Friday anymore, Carter. This is about a pattern going back months. And now that it's out in the open, people aren't staying quiet. Ethan looked down at the folder without opening it, feeling something complicated move through his chest. Relief, vindication, and underneath it all, a low hum of dread about what came next. "What happens to me, sir?" Reyes looked at him for a long moment. "That depends entirely on what's actually in that classified file of yours, Sergeant Carter. Because I've put in a request to review it given the circumstances. I expect I'll hear back within 48 hours. Those 48 hours felt like the longest stretch of Ethan's life since the week Sarah died. He went through the motions of his job inventory checks, manifest sheets, the mundane rhythm that had kept him sane for 6 years while the entire base buzzed around him like a hive that had been kicked over. Everywhere he walked, conversations dropped to whispers. Soldiers who'd laughed at him for months now stared at him with something between fascination and fear, unsure how to reconcile the quiet supply sergeant they thought they knew with the man on that video. Danny Cruz found him at lunch on Tuesday, sliding into the seat across from him without asking. "I filed my statement," Danny said. "Told them everything. Cole cornering me at the loading dock, the burpee thing, all of it." "I heard. Thank you." "You don't have to thank me, Sergeant." Danny hesitated, then pushed forward with something he'd clearly been sitting on. "Can I ask you something? People are saying all kinds of things. Some guys are saying you were Delta. Some are saying Rangers. One guy in my platoon swears you trained at some facility that doesn't officially exist." He leaned in slightly. "Is any of it true?" Ethan set down his fork. "Cruz, I appreciate you standing up for me. I do, but I need you to understand something. What I did, where I did it, who I did it with, that's not a story I get to tell casually over lunch. Some of it, I'm not even sure I'm allowed to tell my own daughter someday. It's not about keeping secrets for the fun of it. It's about the fact that some doors, once you open them, don't close again." Danny sat with that for a moment, something like understanding dawning slowly on his young face. "Okay," he finally said. "I won't ask again. But for what it's worth, Sergeant, whatever you did back then, whoever you were, the guy who stood up for a scared private in a loading dock, the guy who let a bully knock him down for weeks rather than break a promise to his kid, that guy's the one I respect. Not whatever's in some classified file." Ethan felt something tighten in his throat. "That means more than you know, Cruz." Wednesday morning, Reyes called him back into the office, and this time the mood in the room had shifted entirely again. Reyes stood when Ethan walked in, a small gesture, but one that hadn't happened in their previous meetings, and it told Ethan everything he needed to know before a single word was spoken. "Sit down, Sergeant Carter, please." Ethan sat. Reyes remained standing for a moment, staring at a folder on his desk, stamped with markings. Ethan recognized immediately, markings that hadn't crossed his own hands in over 6 years. "I got clearance to review your full record yesterday afternoon," Reyes said slowly. "I want you to know before we go any further that everything in this room stays in this room unless you decide otherwise." "Understood, sir." Reyes opened the folder, though he didn't need to look down at it. It was clear he'd already read every page multiple times. "Staff Sergeant Ethan Carter, 7 years as a close-quarters combat instructor and operator attached to a unit I am not going to name out loud in this office. Decorated 3 times for actions that frankly, Sergeant, read like something out of a film I wouldn't believe if I hadn't seen your service jacket myself." He looked up. "You pulled 2 men out of a compromised position under direct fire in a country this file won't name at a cost that nearly took your own life in the process. You trained soldiers who went on to train other soldiers who are still active today, teaching techniques you developed yourself." Ethan sat perfectly still, hands folded in his lap, saying nothing. "And then," Reyes continued, voice softening, "6 years ago you requested reassignment, voluntary reduction in scope of duty, turned down 2 separate promotions that would have kept you in that world. The file doesn't spell out exactly why, but given what I already know about your personal history—" He paused, respectful, careful. "I think I can guess. My wife died," Ethan said quietly. 6 weeks after Lily was born. Complications nobody saw coming. He stared at a point on the wall somewhere past Rhea's shoulder. "I was supposed to deploy again 8 weeks after that. I put in for a transfer instead. Told my command I needed something stateside, something that would let me actually raise my daughter, instead of leaving her with family every few months while I disappeared into places I couldn't tell anybody about. He finally looked at Reyes directly. They didn't love the decision, but they respected it, and they buried the details deep enough that nobody on a base like this would ever have reason to look. Reyes was quiet for a long moment, processing all of it. You could have told me any of this 6 weeks ago when Mercer started in on you. Could I? Ethan's voice carried a tired edge. Sir, the moment people on this base find out what I used to be, everything changes. I stop being Lily's dad, who happens to work in supply. I become a story, a curiosity. Somebody people want to test or recruit or ask about things I can't talk about. And somewhere down the line, somebody in a much bigger office than yours starts wondering whether a man with my training belongs behind a supply desk at all. His jaw tightened. I didn't survive walking away from that life just to get pulled back into it because a bully couldn't leave me alone. Reyes nodded slowly, something like genuine respect settling into his expression. For what it's worth, Sergeant Carter, I don't think anybody's pulling you back into anything, but I do think this base owes you something it hasn't given you yet. What's that, sir? The truth, out in the open on your terms, not through some leaked video and internet speculation. Reyes closed the folder. The formal review board convenes Friday. Sergeant Mercer's conduct is going to be the primary subject, and given the volume of witness statements that have come in over the past 3 days, I don't think there's much question about the outcome there. But I also think, given how public this has become, you deserve the chance to have your side of this told accurately, not as some mystery internet is speculating wildly about, but as what it actually is. A man who chose his daughter over glory, who endured months of abuse rather than break a promise, and who only stepped in when that abuse crossed a line even he couldn't walk away from. Ethan sat with that for a long moment. I don't want a spectacle, sir. I'm not asking you to make one. I'm asking whether you'd be willing when the time comes to let a small part of the truth out enough to correct the record without compromising anything classified. The rest of it stays exactly where it's always been. Ethan thought of Lily asleep in her room every night, growing up in a world where kids at daycare repeated things their parents said about her father. He thought of Danny Cruz's face at lunch, hungry for a truth he'd earned the right to hear at least a piece of. He thought of Sergeant Ruiz, who'd trusted her own instincts about him before anyone else had the courage to. All right, he said finally. A small part, that's all. Word of the pending review board spread through the base almost as fast as the video itself had. By Thursday, the mood around Cole Mercer had shifted entirely. The instructors who'd once laughed along with his jokes at Ethan's expense now avoided him in the hallways. Recruits who'd once hung on his every word during PT sessions kept their eyes down when he passed. Ethan caught sight of him only once that week across the motor pool, and the difference was staggering. Cole walked with none of his usual swagger, shoulders hunched, eyes hollow, a man who had watched his entire reputation collapse in the span of 3 days and 2 million video views. For a moment, their eyes met across the distance. Cole looked away first. That evening, Ethan received an unexpected visit. He opened his apartment door to find Sergeant Ruiz standing there, along with 2 soldiers he didn't immediately recognize. A woman, introduced as former Specialist Monroe, who'd left the Army 18 months earlier, and a man named Corporal Ashford, currently stationed at a different base entirely, who'd apparently driven 4 hours after seeing the video online. I know this is unusual, Ruiz said, standing slightly apart from the other 2. But these 2 reached out to me after seeing your name mentioned online. They both served under Mercer before you did. Monroe stepped forward, arms crossed, something guarded and tired in her expression. I left the Army partly because of him. He did to me what he did to you, except there wasn't a video and there wasn't anybody willing to stand up for me. I filed a complaint 2 years ago. Nothing happened. They said it was my word against his, and his combative's record spoke louder. Ashford nodded grimly. Same story, different base before he transferred here. He pushed me during a drill hard enough to dislocate my shoulder. called it an accident. I believed him at the time because I didn't know any better. Ethan stood in his doorway, absorbing this feeling, something heavy settle in his chest. I'm sorry that happened to both of you. We're not here for an apology, Monroe said. We're here because we heard there's a review board Friday and we want to submit statements. We should have done it years ago. Maybe if we had none of what happened to you would have happened at all. Ashford added quieter. We just wanted to thank you honestly. Whatever you did in that gym, it's the first time in 3 years anybody's actually made him answer for what he does. Ethan invited them in, made coffee, and spent the next 2 hours listening to stories that made his stomach turn. Years of a pattern. Nobody had ever stopped, buried under a record too impressive for anyone to question, protected by exactly the kind of institutional hesitation that had almost let it happen to him too. By the time they left, both Monroe and Ashford had agreed to submit formal statements to the review board. Ruiz lingered a moment longer at the door. You did something bigger than you probably realize, Carter, she said quietly. Not just for yourself. For every soldier that man ever hurt and got away with it. Ethan closed the door behind her and stood alone in his apartment for a long time, thinking about all the ways a story could ripple outward further than anyone standing at its center ever expected. Friday's review board took place behind closed doors, but word of what happened inside leaked out within the hour, the way everything on this base eventually did. Cole Mercer was formally relieved of his instructor duties pending further investigation. The pattern of behavior documented now, not just in Ethan's case, but in nearly a dozen statements spanning 3 years and 2 different bases, was deemed serious enough to warrant a full Article 15 proceeding with the possibility of further discipline still under review. His black belt, his tournament titles, his years of reputation, none of it could outweigh a paper trail that had finally caught up to him. Ethan wasn't present for most of it. He'd given a brief statement earlier that morning, factual and restrained, describing the pattern of harassment without embellishment. Careful even now to keep the details of his own background to the barest minimum. Reyes had asked of him enough to explain why the takedown had looked the way it did. Not enough to compromise anything classified. He was walking back toward the supply office that afternoon when he ran into Cole in the hallway, both of them alone for the first time since the gym. Cole stopped. For a long moment, neither man said anything. Congratulations, Cole finally said, voice flat, stripped of all its old bravado. You got what you wanted. I never wanted any of this, Cole. Ethan's voice stayed level, no triumph in it, no satisfaction. I wanted you to stop. That's all I ever wanted. Cole let out a short, humorless laugh. You could have ended me in 3 seconds any day of the week for months, and you just let me keep going. Why? Ethan considered the question honestly. Because I made a promise to somebody I loved that I wouldn't be a man who solves things with violence unless there was no other choice left. You made sure eventually that there wasn't. He held Cole's gaze steadily. I'm not proud of what happened in that gym. I'm not ashamed of it either. But I take no joy in watching your career fall apart, whatever you think of me. Cole studied him for a long moment. Something unreadable moving behind his eyes. Not quite remorse, not yet. But the first crack of something that might one day become it. Monroe and Ashford, he said quietly. They came forward too. They did. I didn't know they were still angry about that. It was years ago. People don't forget being made to feel small, Cole. Not for a long time. Sometimes not ever. Ethan paused, then added quieter. You had every tool to be someone who built soldiers up instead of tearing them down. You still might someday if you actually sit with what this cost people. Cole didn't respond to that. He simply nodded once, turned, and walked away down the hallway, and Ethan watched him go with something that felt less like victory and more like a long, tired exhale after holding his breath for months. That weekend, the video crossed 3 million views. National outlets picked up fragments of the story, though most kept it appropriately vague, respecting the ongoing military investigation and Ethan's own reluctance to speak publicly. A few veterans organizations reached out through the base wanting to feature his story requests. Ethan politely declined every single time. What he couldn't decline was Lily's reaction. When at daycare Monday morning, a group of kids surrounded her at pickup, not to mock her this time, but with something closer to awe. "Is your daddy the guy from the video?" one boy asked, eyes wide. "My dad showed me. He said your dad's like one of the toughest guys in the whole army." Lily looked up at Ethan standing a few feet away, signing her out. Confusion and pride tangled together on her small face. "Is that true, Daddy?" Ethan crouched down to her level the same way he always did, and thought for a long moment about how to answer a question 6 years in the making. "It's true that Daddy used to do a job that took a lot of training," he said carefully. "But you know what I'm proudest of? It's not what happened in that gym. It's every single day I get to pick you up right here at exactly this time and hear about your day. That's the job I care about most in the whole world." Lily considered this with the particular seriousness only children bring to conversations that matter to them. "But you're still kind of a superhero," she said finally, matter of fact. "Even if it's a secret one." Ethan laughed a real laugh, the first one in weeks, that didn't carry any weight behind it. "Maybe," he admitted, taking her hand. "Maybe a little bit." They walked home together in the fading afternoon light, and for the first time since this entire ordeal had begun, Ethan Carter felt something settle inside him that resembled peace. Not the deep, hollow silence he'd carried for 6 years, but something fuller, something earned. He didn't know yet that the base commander had already begun drafting a proposal that would change the entire shape of his career. He didn't know that Cole Mercer, sitting alone in his own quarters that same evening, had opened his laptop and started writing something he'd never expected to write in his life. And he didn't know that within 2 weeks, the quiet supply sergeant everyone once called weak would be standing in front of the very gym where it all began, about to be asked to become something he'd spent 6 years running from. All he knew, walking home hand in hand with his daughter beneath a sky just beginning to turn gold at the edges, was that the promise he'd made Sarah all those years ago hadn't been broken after all. It had simply finally been understood. The proposal landed on Captain Reyes's desk exactly 9 days after the review board closed Cole Mercer's case, and by the time Ethan heard about it, the decision had already climbed 2 levels above anyone he'd ever spoken to directly. He found out the way. He found out most things that mattered on this base. Marcus, knocking on his door on a Tuesday evening, phone in hand, grinning like a man who'd been sitting on good news all day and could barely contain it any longer. "You're not going to believe this." Ethan let him in wary. "Believe what?" "Battalion's putting together a new combatives program, base-wide. Not just for recruits, for instructors too, a whole retraining initiative after everything that came out about Mercer." Marcus dropped into his usual chair at the kitchen table, practically vibrating. "They want you to run it." Ethan stood very still. "Me. You. Lead instructor. Full oversight of the curriculum, training methodology, everything." Marcus leaned forward. "Reyes pushed for it personally. Said if half of what happened on this base was because good instructors like Ruiz didn't have the authority to stop somebody like Cole, then the fix isn't just punishing one man. It's rebuilding the whole system under somebody who actually understands what real strength looks like." Ethan sat down slowly across from him, the weight of it settling into his chest, in a way that felt entirely different from every other burden he'd carried over the past 6 years. "I left that life behind for a reason, Marcus. I know. Taking this puts me right back in the middle of it. Attention, visibility, every single thing I spent 6 years trying to avoid. I know that too." Marcus's voice softened. "But Ethan, think about what you'd actually be building. Not the version of combatives training that made men like Cole. A version that teaches restraint, discipline. The stuff you've been living out in front of this whole base for months without anybody even realizing that's what they were watching." He paused. "You keep saying you don't want the spotlight. Maybe this isn't about the spotlight. Maybe it's about what you do with it once it's already found you." Ethan sat with that a long while after Marcus left, staring at the closed door, feeling something shift inside him that he hadn't expected. Not fear this time, not the old instinct to disappear, but something closer to possibility. He didn't decide that night, but he didn't say no either. The following morning, brought a visitor he hadn't expected at all. He was in the supply office sorting through a delivery manifest when a knock came at the open door, and he looked up to find Cole Mercer standing there out of uniform, dressed in civilian clothes. For the first time Ethan had ever seen him. Jeans, a plain gray shirt, nothing to announce him, nothing to perform for. He looked smaller somehow, stripped of the swagger that had defined every previous encounter between them. "Got a minute?" Cole's voice was quiet, careful in a way it had never been before. Ethan set down his clipboard. "Sure." Cole stepped inside but didn't sit hovering near the doorway like a man unsure of his welcome. "I'm being discharged. Other than honorable, not dishonorable, but it's done. Effective end of month." "I heard something about that. I'm not here to relitigate any of it." Cole's jaw tightened, and for a moment the old defensiveness flickered back to the surface before he visibly forced it down. "I earned this. I know I earned this. Monroe, Ashford, the recruits I pushed around here, I spent years telling myself it was tough love, building better soldiers." He shook his head slowly. "It wasn't. I just liked how it felt to be the strongest guy in the room, and I found people who couldn't push back, and I made them pay for making me feel powerful." Ethan waited, saying nothing, letting the silence hold space for whatever Cole needed to say next. "I've been reading some of the messages," Cole continued. "The comments on that video, most of them hate me, some of them—" He let out a short, humorless breath. "Some of them actually get it right. There's this one guy doesn't even know me wrote something like real strength doesn't need an audience. Been sitting with that for a week now." "That sounds about right," Ethan said quietly. Cole finally looked up and met his eyes directly. Something raw and unguarded there that had never once shone through during any of their previous encounters. "Why didn't you end me sooner? You had 100 chances, every single day for months. Any one of them you could have put me on that mat instead of just Friday." Ethan considered the question with the same care he gave everything. "Because the day I decided violence was the answer to a problem, even a problem like you, I'd be breaking a promise that mattered more to me than my own pride. I held out as long as I could." He paused. "You made that impossible eventually. But I want you to understand something, Cole. I didn't step onto that mat to humiliate you back. I stepped onto that mat because you'd stopped leaving me any other way to protect the people you were hurting." Cole absorbed that in silence, nodding slowly, something shifting behind his eyes that looked almost like the first honest reckoning of his adult life. "I don't expect you to forgive any of it. I'm not interested in holding on to anger toward you, Cole. That's not the same as forgiveness, and it's not the same as forgetting what you did to people on this base. But carrying hate around doesn't build anything. I learned that a long time ago the hard way in places I can't really talk about." Ethan's voice stayed even steady. "What are you gonna do now?" Cole was quiet for a moment. "Honestly, I don't know yet. Maybe civilian coaching. Somewhere I actually have to answer for how I treat people instead of hiding behind rank." A faint, humorless smile crossed his face. "Funny thing is, some of what I taught in that gym, the actual technique, it was good. It's just everything wrapped around it that was rotten." "Then maybe that's where you start," Ethan offered. "Keep what was worth keeping, burn the rest down, and build something better on top of it." Cole studied him a long moment, then extended a hand, tentative, uncertain, the first genuinely humble gesture Ethan had ever seen from him. "For what it's worth, Carter, you're the toughest man I've ever met. Not because you dropped me in 3 seconds, because you didn't for months when you clearly could have." Ethan shook his hand. "Take care of yourself, Cole." Cole nodded once, turned and walked out of the supply office, out of Ethan's life, carrying with him the first real seeds of whatever he might eventually become. Word of Cole's discharge spread through the base with far less fanfare than his humiliation had the way endings so often do, quiet, almost anticlimactic, compared to the explosive beginning that had started it all. But the ripple effects of everything that happened continued, reaching further than Ethan could have anticipated. Monroe reached out again that week, this time with news of her own. She'd connected with 2 other former soldiers, online women, who'd left the service under circumstances eerily similar to her own, and together they'd started informal conversations about pushing for clearer reporting protocols across multiple installations. She credited Ethan directly in an online post that quickly picked up traction of its own. "6 months ago, I thought nobody would believe me if I came forward. Then I watched a quiet supply sergeant finally get pushed too far, and I watched an entire base finally listen. If it can happen for him, it can happen for the rest of us too." Ethan read the post once, feeling something complicated move through him. Pride tangled with a persistent discomfort at being anyone's symbol, at having his private ordeal turned into a rallying point for people he'd never even met. He mentioned it to Sergeant Ruiz over coffee later that week. "You don't have to be comfortable with it," Ruiz told him matter of fact. "Doesn't change the fact that it's true. What happened to you gave other people permission to say something they'd been sitting on for years. That's not nothing, Carter. That's not something you should shrink away from. I never wanted to be anybody's symbol. Nobody who deserves to be one ever does." Ruiz took a sip of her coffee, studying him over the rim of the cup. "You gonna take the instructor position?" Ethan hesitated. "I don't know yet. Can I tell you something honestly, as somebody who watched you get humiliated in that gym for months and didn't do enough to stop it myself?" Ruiz set her cup down, expression serious now. "This base needs somebody who understands the difference between building soldiers up and tearing them down. We had exactly the wrong kind of man running that program for years, and it took something enormous blowing up in public before anybody higher up cared enough to fix it. If you turn this down, there's a real chance they hire somebody who looks impressive on paper and repeats the exact same mistakes. That's a lot of weight to put on one decision." "It is," Ruiz agreed. "But you've been carrying weight nobody else on this base could handle for months now. What's a little more if it means doing some actual good with it?" That weekend, Ethan drove Lily out to the small cemetery 2 hours from base where Sarah was buried. Something he did every few months, though he'd always gone alone before. This time, unprompted, he brought her along, holding her small hand as they walked across the grass toward the modest headstone bearing her mother's name. Lily had asked questions about her mother before, the kind of questions 6-year-olds ask without fully understanding the weight behind them, and Ethan had always answered gently, carefully, giving her pieces of the truth sized for wherever she was in her understanding. This time, standing in front of the grave with the events of the past month still settling inside him, he found himself telling her more than he ever had before. "Your mom used to say something to me," he said quietly, crouching down beside her at the edge of the grass. "She said real strength isn't about being the toughest person in the room. It's about having the power to hurt somebody and choosing not to until there's no other way left to protect the people you love." Lily considered this with her characteristic seriousness. "Is that why you didn't fight back for so long, even when that man was mean to you?" "That's exactly why." Ethan placed a small bundle of flowers against the headstone, the same kind Sarah had always kept in a vase on their kitchen table years ago, in a life that felt impossibly distant now. "I promised your mom I'd raise you to understand that strength and kindness aren't opposites, that the strongest people are often the gentlest ones, right up until the moment gentleness stops being enough." "Do you think she'd be proud of you for what happened in the gym?" Ethan's throat tightened, and for a long moment he couldn't answer. When he finally did, his voice came out rougher than he intended. "I hope so, baby girl. I really hope so." Lily reached up and took his hand, small fingers wrapping around his, and they stood together in silence for a long while, the wind moving gently through the grass around them, before finally turning to walk back to the car. On the drive home, somewhere around the halfway mark, Lily spoke up from the back seat apropos of nothing. "Daddy, I think you should teach the soldiers. The ones you told me about. The new class." Ethan glanced at her in the rearview mirror, surprised. "Why do you say that?" "Because you're good at knowing when to be strong and when to be gentle. Miss Rivera says that's a really hard thing to learn. I think you should teach other people how to do it too." Something in Ethan's chest cracked open, warm and sudden, at the simple, devastating clarity only a child could offer. He drove the rest of the way home, turning her words over and over, and by the time they pulled into the driveway, the decision that had been sitting unmade inside him for over a week had finally quietly settled into place. Monday morning, Ethan walked into Captain Reyes's office and accepted the position before Reyes had even finished laying out the formal terms. "You're certain?" Reyes asked, surprised by how quickly the answer came. "I'm certain." Ethan sat across from him, steady in a way that felt entirely different from every previous conversation in this office. "But I've got conditions, sir, if you're willing to hear them." "I'm listening." "The program doesn't run the way Cole's did. No humiliation as a teaching tool. No singling out soldiers in front of their peers to make a point. Every instructor under this program reports directly to me, and every single complaint gets investigated within a week, not buried for years the way Monroe's and Ashford's were." Ethan's voice carried an authority Reyes had never heard from him before, quiet but absolute. "And I want a clear channel for soldiers to report concerns without fear that it'll cost them their standing. That's non-negotiable." Reyes studied him for a long moment, something like genuine respect breaking across his face. "You've got it. All of it." "Then I accept." They shook hands across the desk, and Ethan walked out of that office feeling for the first time in 6 years like the past and the present had finally stopped pulling against each other in opposite directions. The first day of the new program arrived 3 weeks later, and word had spread through the base long before then, curiosity building steadily with every passing day. When Ethan walked into the gym that morning, the same gym where Cole had shoved him to the floor, the same mat where he'd finally ended it in 3 seconds, he found it packed wall to wall far beyond the recruits officially enrolled. Soldiers from other units had shown up simply to watch, word having traveled that the man from the video was finally stepping onto the mat as an instructor instead of a target. He stood at the front of the formation, scanning the faces looking back at him. Danny Cruz, near the front row, having transferred voluntarily into the program the moment it opened. Private Chen, no longer trembling the way she had under Cole's aggressive teaching, standing tall, with something like hope in her expression. Sergeant Ruiz off to the side, arms crossed, watching with quiet pride. Even Marcus had shown up leaning against the far wall with a grin he wasn't bothering to hide. "Morning," Ethan said, and his voice carried across the gym without needing to be raised, the kind of authority that came not from volume, but from something people could simply feel. "Before we start anything, I want to be honest with you about what this program is and what it isn't." The room went quiet, attentive. "This isn't going to be about proving who's the toughest person in the room. If that's what you're here for, you're in the wrong place." He let his gaze move slowly across the formation. "I spent months on this exact mat being told I was weak, being humiliated in front of most of the people standing here right now. And I want you to understand something clearly. Everything you think you know about strength, about what it looks like, about who has it and who doesn't, is probably wrong." A murmur moved through the crowd, uncertain but engaged. "Real strength," Ethan continued, "isn't about how fast you can put somebody on the ground. It's about the discipline to walk away from a fight you could win every single day until the moment walking away stops being an option. It's about protecting the people around you, especially the ones who can't protect themselves. It's about choosing compassion even when the whole world's laughing at you for it, because you understand something they don't yet." He paused, letting the words settle. "That's what I'm here to teach. The technique is important, but it comes second to that." He looked out at the formation at Danny, nodding slowly at Chen's eyes, bright with something that looked almost like relief, at faces that had once laughed along with Cole's cruelty, now watching him with a respect that had nothing to do with fear. "All right," he said, clapping his hands together once. "Let's get to work." The weeks that followed transformed the gym into something none of them had ever known it could be. Ethan built the curriculum from the ground up, technique paired always with restraint drilling built around scenarios of protection rather than domination. Every session ending with a conversation about judgment, about when force was necessary and when it wasn't. He never once raised his voice. He never once humiliated a struggling recruit in front of their peers. When Private Chen fumbled a takedown during her second week, the same drill that had reduced her to tears under Cole's instruction, Ethan simply knelt beside her, walked her through the mechanics, slowly, patiently, until she landed it clean on her fourth attempt. and looked up at him with an expression of pure disbelieving pride. "You didn't yell at me?" she said, almost surprised. "Why would I yell at somebody who's trying—" Ethan helped her to her feet. "You're not here because you're already perfect, Chen. You're here to get better. That takes patience, not fear." Word of the program's atmosphere spread just as quickly as word of Cole's cruelty once had, except this time the story traveled with something warmer attached to it. Enrollment doubled within a month. Soldiers who'd avoided combatives training entirely under Cole's regime started signing up voluntarily, drawn by rumors of an instructor who actually cared whether they succeeded. Danny Cruz. 3 months in approached Ethan after a session with something he'd clearly been building up the nerve to say. "I want to become an instructor someday," he said. "Under you. I want to learn to teach it the way you do." Ethan studied him, something like pride swelling in his chest. "You've got good instincts, Cruz. Better than you probably realize. But being an instructor isn't just about technique. It's about who you're willing to become for the people counting on you." "I know that now," Danny said, and something in his voice carried real conviction. "I watched you get pushed to the floor in this exact gym and take it without ever losing who you were. That's the kind of instructor I want to be someday. Not the guy everybody's scared of. The guy everybody trusts." Ethan clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Then you're already halfway there." 4 months after that Friday in the gym, the base held a small ceremony, not the elaborate spectacle some had expected, given how far the story had traveled online, but a modest gathering in the same gym. Soldiers from every unit filling the bleachers. Captain Reyes standing at a podium set up near the mat. Ethan stood off to the side, uncomfortable with the attention even now watching, as Reyes addressed the assembled crowd. "6 months ago, this base witnessed something none of us are proud of," Reyes said, voice carrying across the silent gym. "A pattern of cruelty that went unaddressed for far too long, aimed at a man who chose silence and restraint over violence day after day, for reasons most of us didn't understand, until it was almost too late." He paused, glancing toward Ethan. What we learned in the aftermath wasn't just about one bad actor. It was about an entire culture that mistook cruelty for toughness, that let volume and aggression stand in for actual strength. The crowd remained quiet. Attentive, many faces Ethan recognized from those early weeks. Soldiers who had laughed. Soldiers who had looked away. Soldiers who had simply not known what to do. Sergeant First Class Ethan Carter. Reyes continued, and Ethan felt his stomach tighten at the promotion attached to his name. Something he hadn't fully processed yet. Has spent the last 4 months rebuilding this base's entire approach to combatives training. Not through punishment or humiliation, but through patience, discipline, and an understanding of strength that this army would do well to learn from more broadly. He gestured for Ethan to join him at the podium. Ethan walked forward slowly, aware of every eye in the gym, following him. Aware of how different this silence felt from the silence that had once followed him out of this same room in disgrace. He stood at the podium for a long moment before speaking, gathering himself. "I'm not much for speeches," he said finally, voice carrying easily across the quiet gym. "So I'll keep this short." A few soft laughs rippled through the crowd, warm this time, nothing like the laughter that had once followed him. 6 months ago, most of you watched a man get humiliated in this gym week after week, and most of you didn't say anything. He let that sit, watching a few faces shift uncomfortably without judgment in his voice, only honesty. "I'm not here to shame anybody for that. I understand why. Speaking up costs something, and most of us aren't taught how to pay that cost until we're forced to." He paused, glancing toward Danny, toward Chen, toward Ruiz. "But some of you did speak up eventually. Some of you filed statements when it mattered. Some of you reached out to people you'd never met because you recognized something in what happened here that needed saying. That took its own kind of courage, and I want you to know it mattered." He looked out over the crowd, thinking of Sarah, thinking of the promise he'd carried for 6 years, thinking of every moment he'd walked away instead of fighting back. "I made a promise a long time ago to somebody I loved very much." He continued, voice steady, despite the weight behind the words. that I would never let violence become my first answer to anything. I kept that promise through months of things that would have broken most men's patience, because I believed, and I still believe, that real strength isn't about proving you're tougher than everybody else in the room. His eyes found Lily sitting in the front row beside Marcus, watching her father with an expression of pure, uncomplicated pride. It's about having the power to hurt someone and choosing compassion instead, for as long as compassion is possible. And when it stops being possible, when protecting the people who can't protect themselves leaves you no other choice, that's the only time strength should ever show its teeth. The gym remained silent for a long moment after he finished, and then slowly the applause began. Not the mocking laughter that had once filled this same room, but something genuine. Something earned, rolling across the bleachers until every single soldier present was on their feet. Ethan stood at that podium overwhelmed, watching his daughter beam up at him from the front row, and felt something inside him finally completely settle. 6 years of grief and discipline and silent endurance, folding into something that finally felt whole. That evening, after the ceremony ended, after the crowd had dispersed and the gym had emptied back into ordinary quiet, Ethan walked out to the parking lot hand in hand, with Lily Marcus trailing a few steps behind, still grinning from the afternoon's events. "You did good today, Sergeant First Class Carter," Marcus said, testing the new rank with obvious enjoyment. "Never thought I'd see the day." "Neither did I," Ethan admitted, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, there was no weight behind those words, only quiet satisfaction. Lily tugged at his hand, looking up at him with the particular brightness she reserved for moments she considered especially important. "Daddy, everybody clapped for you. Even the man who used to be mean." Ethan glanced towards the edge of the parking lot where Cole Mercer stood near his car, dressed in civilian clothes, having driven back onto base that morning specifically to attend. Their eyes met across the distance, and Cole offered a small, genuine nod, not the cocky grin of months past, but something humbler, something that looked like the beginning of a man finally learning to carry his own weight differently. Ethan nodded back. "Some people can change, baby girl," he said quietly, watching Cole climb into his car and drive away out of the base, out of this chapter of both their lives. "It doesn't happen overnight, but it happens sometimes when the right thing finally breaks through." They walked the rest of the way to the car in comfortable silence. The base settling into evening around them, soldiers passing by with nods and smiles that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. Word of the ceremony would spread the way everything did on this base, but this time the story people carried with them wasn't one of mockery. It was one of a quiet man who had endured everything asked of him, who had held his ground without ever raising his voice, and who had finally shown an entire base what real strength actually looked like. Not the loudest man in the room, not the one throwing the hardest punches, but the one who chose gentleness, until gentleness ran out, and who used every ounce of what remained to protect the people who needed protecting. Ethan Carter had spent 6 years being underestimated, mocked and dismissed by men who never once understood what silence could hold. But in the end, it wasn't the 3 seconds on that mat that defined him. It was everything that came before it. The months of restraint, the promise kept, even when it cost him everything, the quiet discipline of a father who chose his daughter over his own pride, day after day, until the world finally caught up to who he'd been all along. And as he drove home that night with Lily singing along to the radio in the back seat, Ethan Carter understood more clearly than he ever had before that the weakest soldier everyone once mocked had never been weak at all. He had simply been waiting for the moment strength needed to mean something more than winning.